devotes a whole book to saying that he cannot solve the problem of things in general.
Bagshaw. Underhill. So what do we have here?
Oh, the usual.
Then what do you need me for? You're the police detective.
Right. And you're the bloomin' amateur detective. Still, you always seem to be the one who solves the problem.
Oh, you always solve it too, Bagshaw.
Yes, Underhill, but I always solve it wrong. And then you turn up with the correct solution. So I thought I'd just save myself the trouble and invite you here at the beginning rather than the end.
Well, no harm in that, I suppose.
Ours is the only trade in which the professional is always supposed to be wrong. Have I noticed that? People don't write stories in which hairdressers can't cut hair until they're explained how to do it by a customer, or in which a cabman can't drive his cab until his fare explains to him the philosophy of cab driving.
That's true enough, Bagshaw.
But for all that, I don't deny we often tend to get into a rut. We sometimes have the disadvantages of going by a rule. But I'll tell you where the detective story writers are wrong. They never allow us even the advantages of going by a rule.
Well, come now, Bagshaw. Sherlock Holmes would say he went by a rule. A logical rule.
And he may be right with his logical rule, but I mean a collective rule. It's like the staff work of an army. We pool our information.
And you don't think detective stories allow for that?
Well, let's take an imaginary case of Sherlock Holmes and Lestrade, the official detective. Now, Sherlock Holmes can guess that a total stranger crossing the street is a foreigner merely because he seems to look for the traffic to go to the right instead of the left. Now, I'm quite willing to admit that Sherlock Holmes might guess that. I'm quite certain Lestrade would guess nothing of the kind. But what they leave out is the fact that the policeman who couldn't guess might already know merely because he's a policeman. Lestrade might know the man was a foreigner because his department is to keep an eye on all foreigners. Some might say on all natives, too.
Well, that's very interesting. So what do you want to tell me about the case?
Right. Let's see here. Man in a Bulgarian uniform killed with an Australian boomerang near a Brompton milk shop.
No suspects, I assume?
I already took the trouble to release all the most suspicious persons of interest.
And any other evidence, Bagshaw?
The only things found near the corpse, Underhill, were a bootlace, a button hook, a French newspaper, and a return ticket from the Hebrides.
I think I can tell you precisely how it was done. And I think I can tell you exactly why it was done. And I think I can tell you specifically who did it.
But you're not going to find out who did it. Why? Well, for two reasons. First, one should never give away the end of a detective story. And secondly, this particular detective story has never been written. G.K. Chesterton introduced the two characters of Bagshaw and Underhill in one of his Father Brown stories, but he never did anything else with them other than to make fun of detective stories, especially the convention of the amateur detective rescuing the bumbling police detective. But if Chesterton made fun of detective stories, it was only because he was making fun of himself. And as we know, he had a lot of himself to make fun of. Not only did he make a good part of his living writing detective stories, he spent a good part of his time reading detective stories. It's interesting that this great defender of the faith, great defender of life, great lover of life, and great liver of life, plotted and planned over 50 murders in his time and carried all of them out, if only on paper, and only for our reading pleasure. Chesterton says that the great advantage that the literary murderer has is that he can sit happily by his own peaceful fireside, devising 15 or 20 ways of murdering his wife, make money from it, and yet retain his wife after all. Until Chesterton came along, there were really only two kinds of detective stories. There were the Sherlock Holmes stories, and there were the bad imitations of the Sherlock Holmes stories. They all involved the super sleuth, the detective whose powers of deduction were somewhat unnatural, the sort of guy who can hear someone walking in the next room and figure out that one of his parents was Romanian. But Chesterton did something totally different. He introduced the underdog detective, someone who's not merely on the same playing field as the rest of us, but who seems outmatched by his opponent. And who was this underdog detective? It was Father Brown. The fact that Father Brown is a Catholic priest is important because in early 20th century England, Catholic priests were unimportant. That's the great inspiration for this character. He is in fact based on a real priest named Father John O'Connor, with whom Chesterton became friends, and with whom Chesterton was very impressed, but with whom other people were not particularly impressed. In fact, they were even dismissive of him because of the fact that he was a priest. Chesterton realized the possible advantage that such a character would have because of his perceived disadvantage. According to Ronald Knox, who was also a detective story writer and who was also a Catholic priest, Chesterton actually wrote the first Father Brown story because he was a writer and needed money. He went to a publisher's office and asked what was selling. Detective fiction, he was told. So he sat down right there in the waiting room and penned The Blue Cross, introducing to the world that officious little loafer with the face of a dumpling, Father Brown. He would go on to write over 50 more Father Brown stories, and they continued to be the most popular thing that he ever wrote. And there's a reason for that. It has less to do with Chesterton than with the reading tastes of the public, which are reflected by Chesterton's own reading tastes. The public likes detective stories. Why is that? Well, first of all, we like detective fiction because we have an innate sense of justice. We are pleased to see justice acted out. We can't let murderers get away with murder and thieves get away with the goods. The moral order has to be preserved. The police detective is that poetic figure who represents the moral order and represents civilization itself.
It is the constant tendency of the old Adam to rebel against civilization, to preach departure and rebellion by dealing with the unsleeping sentinels who guard the outposts of society. The detective story reminds us that we live in an armed camp, making war with a chaotic world, and that the criminals, the children of chaos, are nothing but the traitors within our gates. When the detective in a police romance stands alone, fearless amid the knives and fists of a thieves' kitchen, it does certainly serve to make us remember that it is the agent of social justice who is the original and poetic figure. The romance of the police force is thus the romance of man.
Every good story is a moral story. Children who love stories more than anyone understand this. In fact, they demand it from a story. A good murder mystery is always a moral tale. It's all about the commandment, thou shalt not kill. It's about right versus wrong, good versus evil. But Chesterton also argues that sensational novels are the most moral part of modern fiction because they present that abstract that any literature that represents life as dangerous and startling is truer than any literature that represents it as dubious and languid. However, by the end of his life, Chesterton saw an increasing tendency in even detective fiction to go the way of modern literature. That is, it began to reflect the morality of the modern world, or rather, the lack of morality. Detective fiction became less moral because when there is no code of morals, says Chesterton, Anybody may murder anybody because anybody may marry anybody. Obviously, a character like Father Brown represents morality, represents the good. In representing the moral order, Father Brown defends the faith, but he also defends reason.
The people will tell you that theories don't matter, and that logic and philosophy aren't practical. Don't you believe them? Reason is from God, and when things are unreasonable, there is something the matter.
You might almost say that Father Brown makes reason one of the virtues, or at least shows how connected it is to the virtues.
People who lose all their charity generally lose all their logic.
In addition to the moral aspect, there's another reason that we like detective stories. We like surprises.
The detective story differs from every other story in this, that the reader is only happy if he feels a fool. The essence of a mystery tale is that we are suddenly confronted with a truth which we have never suspected, and yet can see to be true.
Chesterton says a good detective story should be simple. It is almost the definition of a bad detective story that it is complicated. The ideal story does not depend on a mass of details that nobody could possibly know. It depends on one fact which anybody could easily guess, but nobody does. For the murder story has for its high and holy purpose the pious intention of making the reader feel like a fool. It is thus an encouragement to Christian humility and the most excellent leveler of the foolish and the wise. When we read a detective story and are jolted by the solution that we did not see coming and that we should have seen coming, it's something like a spiritual awakening. It's almost an act of repentance because it means admitting that we were wrong now that the truth has been revealed. This act of revelation is essential to the detective story. The author of the story enlightens us, but he enlightens us in such a manner that each successive portion of the truth comes as a surprise. Chesterton says that in this, as in much nobler types of mystery, the object of the true mystic is not merely to mystify, but to illuminate. The object is not darkness, but light in the form of lightning.
Real mystics don't hide mysteries, they reveal them.
There are two kinds of mystery. There's the mystery that is a puzzle to be solved, the temporary mystery, and there is the mystery that is a marvel to be contemplated, the permanent mystery. Solving the puzzle, the temporary mystery, satisfies us, but it only satisfies us once. The eternal mystery is endless, and yet in contemplating it, we are endlessly satisfied. The ultimate mystery, the mystery of life, the mystery of God, is not something that we can solve and then walk away from. It is an ongoing mystery that we keep walking into. We face it again and again at every turn. We come upon strange events in life, strange things that cannot be explained, because the explanation is bigger than we can comprehend, the meaning more than our minds can hold.
We are here on the wrong side of the tapestry. The things that happen here do not seem to mean anything. They mean something somewhere else.
What are the connections between the two kinds of mystery, between the puzzle to be solved in a few pages and the ultimate truth that keeps revealing itself from age to age? What is the connection between the detective story and Christianity? Well, besides the connection between faith and reason, there are four biblical principles that form the basis of good detective fiction. Number one, the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. Chesterton says that when a banker is found stabbed and a notorious thief is found standing over him holding a bloody knife, we can be sure that whoever's guilty of this murder, it won't be the notorious thief with the bloody knife. He's too obvious a suspect. No. The killer has to be the last person we suspect. If the story's well managed, we should have a real moment of disturbance when the minister of the banker's church is summoned before his bishop and charged with the crime, and another moment of pleasing emotion when the crime is pinned on the bishop himself. The judgment at the end of any sensational detective story, says Chesterton, is like the judgment at the end of the world. It's unexpected. Just as the author of the story reveals the spotless aristocrat as the instigator of some unthinkable misdeed, so the author of Christianity told us that in the end the bolt would fall with a brutal novelty, and he that exalted himself would be abased. The second biblical principle in detective stories is this: seek and ye shall find. Chesterton says humanity hates the idea of anything being hidden. That is, it hates the idea of anything being successfully hidden. Hide and seek is a popular pastime because it assumes the truth of the text, seek and ye shall find. The pleasure is all in the poignant moment of passing from not knowing to knowing. Mystery stories are very popular, but that's because the author of the mystery story reveals what is hidden. We seek because there's clues leading us to the answer. We examine the evidence because it points to the solution.
The mystery of man is exactly like the mystery of God. That is, we have to suffer in both cases, not from an absence of evidence, but from an extravagant welter of evidence. The detective in human and divine affairs goes mad from the abundance of clues.
The third biblical principle, and the one that Chesterton excelled at more than any other writer of detective fiction, is love your enemies. Father Brown not only seeks till he finds, he tracks down sinners in order to forgive them. But that is the mission of the church, to hunt down sinners, to find them out, to make them confess their crimes in order to forgive them. Father Brown always solves the crime, but he often lets the criminal go because he's more interested in saving the soul of the criminal than in punishing him. And the Father Brown stories may be unique in the genre of detective fiction, in that it's the only series where the arch enemy of the detective ends up becoming his chief ally and sidekick. That's because Father Brown completely wins him over. Loving our enemies does not mean crushing them, it means converting them, turning them into our friends. It's because we care about the truth that we want to bring all men to the truth. And bringing men to the truth brings us to the fourth biblical principle for the detective story, perhaps the most important one. The truth shall set you free. Not only does the criminal need to confess his crime, but we need to be released from the mystery. We need to know the truth. Anything that keeps us separated from the truth is the work of evil.
The true God was made flesh and dwelt among us. And I tell you, wherever you find men ruled merely by mystery, it is the mystery of iniquity. If the devil tells you something is too fearful to look at it. If he tells you something is too terrible to hear it. If you think some truth unbearable, bear it.
There is a joy in solving the puzzle because there's a joy in the truth. Or as Chesterton says, there is a joy in the right realization of things. I'm Dale Ahlquist. Please join us again for the Apostle of Common Sense, and please support the American Chesterton Society and help us make common sense